You see this?
Hello, I'm Kate Spiliopoulos, Head of Events at Centre for London. Welcome to London Conference 2020. 2020 has been an extraordinary year for London, but in many ways also a terrible one. And we feel that something that's common to many people's experience is that there's just such a high volume of things happening. There's the sense of too much news and not being able to process all of it, even this weekend alone. So we hope that London Conference 2020 will provide you with some breathing space and give you a chance to step back, take a look at what's happened and how we got here. And we hope over the next 4 days, we'll be able to say confidently at the end what we want to do differently, how we want the future to look, and what steps we're all going to take to get there. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us this morning. I'd like to also point out that we have a wonderful group of speakers to share with you this year, and we're very grateful to everybody for their participation. We're also grateful to our sponsors of London Conference, without whom the event wouldn't be able to happen. Those sponsors include major sponsors, the Corporation of the City of London, L&Q, and Uber. Supporting sponsors, London Councils, the London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera, and Trust for London, and exhibiting sponsors, Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. While we're setting the stage this morning, a word about that stage. I know that everybody listening and watching this morning has probably had a Zoom incident or two over the past 8 months. Our speakers and our dedicated Centre for London staff are trying as hard as they can to present you with a perfect London conference. But if there are any difficulties over the next 4 days, please bear with us. We'd never done an online event before this March, but now they seem to be a way of life, both for Centre for London and for a lot of people watching, I'm sure. If you're going to be following the event this morning online, use the hashtag LUNCONF20, that's LONCONF 20. And if you're in the Zoom webinar this morning, you can submit questions for Ben Rogers at the end of his presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you see any really good questions, you can upvote them as well. I'll be back to moderate that Q&A. We're going to be opening the conference with a keynote speech from Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, which is very exciting. But right now, I'd like to hand off to the Director of Centre for London, Ben Rogers.
Thank you, Kate, and a very warm welcome from me as well. When we began organising this conference at the beginning of the year, we never envisaged it would be a remote event. But that does have one great advantage, which is we can have a much larger audience than we could otherwise accommodate. And it's just really great to have you all here today. And I'm really pleased to kick off proceedings with a keynote from Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Sadiq.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the Centre for London, not only for the opportunity to speak today, but for all the brilliant work it continues to do. I see this think tank as our city's brain trust, constantly putting out high quality, thoughtful and timely work, something that will be more important than ever as we look to solve the huge challenges we face in the months, years and decades ahead. And I really enjoyed reading the recent London at a Crossroads report, a thought-provoking piece that highlighted some of the choices and challenges in London's future. I must begin by talking about the important news from the weekend and the impact this will have on our city. The way the government dithered and delayed over recent weeks meant that the Prime Minister was left with no choice but to introduce a second national lockdown. If we've learned anything since the start of this pandemic, is that the best way to control this virus is to act early and decisively. That's why I, along with many others, spent weeks urging the government to listen to the scientific advice and to introduce a short national circuit breaker when we still could. This would not only have saved lives, but enabled us to avoid the terrible economic harm that a longer national lockdown will now inevitably cause. I know many Londoners and businesses across our city will be extremely angry that the right action was not taken at the right time. I am too. But I'm certainly not going to make a political speech today. That being said, we can't varnish the truth, because the fact is we've all been let down by central government, and the consequences will be devastating. More lives lost, more jobs at risk, and more livelihoods ruined. It's now absolutely imperative that the government doesn't repeat the same mistakes when it comes to the additional economic support that will clearly be needed. Ministers have a once in a generation responsibility to provide the public funding required to prop up our economy through this period. And as Mayor, I can assure you that I'll continue to put pressure on the government to do whatever's needed. It's clear that the months and years ahead are going to be extremely tough, testing our city unlike any time since the Second World War. We don't yet know what the full extent of the economic and social impact will be on London, or how many of the changes we've seen already are temporary or represent a more permanent shift. But it's hard not to conclude that major structural change is affecting our city over a very compressed timescale. This is likely to have significant ramifications for public transport, planning, economic development, and quality of life. I've always believed that politicians must be honest with the public. That's why I'll never downplay or shy away from acknowledging these difficult challenges that London faces, particularly now as we enter another national lockdown. But that doesn't mean I still don't hold out hope for the future, because out of darkness, we've already seen some chinks of light, particularly how in these turbulent times, Londoners have not turned their backs on each other. Instead, they've pulled together and looked out for one another. We've seen the Clap for Carers, which started here in London and became a weekly national ritual. Londoners dropping off food for vulnerable and older neighbours, and complete strangers phoning one another to ward off loneliness and poor mental health. These countless small acts of community kindness have shown how Londoners together can make a real difference. None of this surprises me, because I know this city and I know Londoners. After all, I owe London everything. It gave me the opportunities to go from the council estate where I grew up to being mayor. And my overarching ambition and vision today remains the same as when I was first elected: to make London a fairer place where everyone gets the opportunities our city gave to me and my family, where everyone, regardless of their race, religion, class, sexuality, or background, gets the chance to reach their full potential. And despite the enormous challenges ahead, my belief that we can build this more equal city has not been diminished. Because over the last 4 years, we've already shown what's possible, from making massive strides in tackling air pollution to starting to build a record number of council homes last year. And now, as a city, I believe we can rally around our shared hopes for the future, for a fairer, cleaner, greener city where a greater emphasis is put on the quality of life, where we no longer take for granted the delivery drivers, postal workers, refuse collectors, health and transport workers, all those who prevented our city from collapsing in recent months, where we invest in our young people, where we build the affordable homes for the many, not the luxury penthouses for the privileged few, where our precious diversity is championed for what it is, not a weakness, but our city's greatest strength, where we tackle head on the poverty, deprivation, and poor health that's been exposed and exacerbated by COVID-19, and where the deep-seated racial inequalities that have scarred our society for decades are not only fully acknowledged, but tackled with the urgency it deserves. Already, the work has started. London's Recovery Board is bringing together representatives from the public, private, and voluntary sectors. We've set ourselves an overarching grand challenge of restoring confidence in our city, minimizing the impact on communities, and building back better our economy and society. We've already established 9 missions covering a range of key structural challenges we face. These cover areas like skills, high streets, mental health, digital access, and support for young people. It's a totally new way of working that's helping to break down barriers between organisations, and it's leading others across London to look at how they can contribute to the missions and pool our resources and expertise, which is exactly what's going to be needed and needs to happen. There's certainly a long way to go, but the foundations are in place for building a better London. And for as long as I'm mayor, I'll be driven every single day to deliver this mission and this vision, driven to use the way Londoners have been pulling together as a springboard for positive change, and driven by my overwhelming desire to build a better London that truly works for everyone. Londoners pulling together will also be critical as we deal with an increasingly hostile domestic environment. We have a government that seems happy to undermine our capital city and that attacks us to shore up their vote in other parts of the country. It feels like London has too often become the scapegoat for many of Britain's problems. But stoking populist division is a dangerous game, one that never leads to progress for those who feel neglected, only more conflict, bitterness, and disharmony. Things certainly don't feel much like a United Kingdom at the moment. Sometimes other parts of the country point the finger at London. But this unhappiness is misdirected. Too often it's not London, but Whitehall and Westminster that's the source of unhappiness. Our city should not be tarred with the failings of the national government simply because it's based in SW1. Of course, I see how some decisions by this government can look London-centric and annoy colleagues in the north. But when cities and regions bicker, we fall into the government's trap because it's in their interests that we're pitted against one another, fighting a zero-sum game over money. It means they can retain control at a national level, and it deflects from the actual problems we should be focusing on, from ensuring sufficient investment in all our areas to getting much more meaningful devolution so that we can weaken the stranglehold of Whitehall. So instead of succumbing to the government's divide and rule tactics, we need to rally together. The truth is, we have so much in common. I know that the people of Liverpool, Manchester, and Sheffield sometimes feel remote from Whitehall, but so do the people of Lewisham, Mitcham, and Southall. And take it from me, from my position as Mayor of London, it certainly doesn't feel like London is getting special treatment from this government. Quite the opposite. Just look at the way ministers have tried to impose punitive conditions on transport for London, even though Londoners have done the right thing to tackle COVID-19. Thankfully, we managed to see off the worst of the conditions that the government wanted. But I find it hard to express my anger and frustration at how much time and effort was spent on these negotiations when the sole focus should be on the real priority, fighting the pandemic. I believe this fight over TfL was a prime example of why we need to work together across cities and regions. Because without a successful, locally accountable TfL, there will be little future for transport for the North, transport for the West Midlands, and so on. So unless we resist the temptation to turn on each other and instead stick together and stand up for the funding and the powers that all mayors need, we'll allow the government to dictate the terms. The fact is, our country needs a total reset in how things are run. Gone are the days of Whitehall knows best. These aren't my words, but those of the government's own manifesto less than a year ago. Londoners need much more say over how their taxes are levied and spent, and how our whole city is run. The same is true for Mancunians, Liverpudlians, Brummies, and Sheffielders. Shamefully, instead of working with local authorities and mayors during the pandemic, the government has been hoarding more power in the centre, all under the cover of a national emergency. The London plan is being undermined. TfL is being squeezed. More and more national controls are being added to areas of devolved responsibility, like affordable housing. And a new era of austerity is being forced on London, with deep budget cuts facing the GLA and London councils, as well as other public services. All of this is threatening the very institutions of local democracy. And it's a massive distraction at a time when all our focus should be on tackling COVID-19. And by the way, none of this is about me, Andy Burnham, or Steve Rotherham. It's about standing up for the integrity of our institutions and the importance of devolution. In London, the mayoralty was created with a strong democratic mandate in a referendum. Attempts to unpick this by stealth are simply illegitimate and wrong. We can't afford to go back to how it was when London lacked any kind of strategic leadership. That's why we all need to be ready for the battles ahead. Londoners, business groups, local authorities, and people across civil society. And it's why we need to stand in solidarity with our colleagues across the country. Because as a powerful block of towns, cities, regions, and devolved administrations, we can challenge the status quo. So let me just finish with this, Ben. It's going to be very tough for our city for some time to come, and the recovery will be a bumpy road. We have a duty to do all we can to protect businesses and organizations until we can come out of the other side of this pandemic. And we'll all need to rally together as we ride out the coming months. But I have no doubt will prevail. The energy and ingenuity of Londoners will get us through and drive our recovery. It was King George VI who, during the Blitz, said, "It is not the walls that make the city, but the people who live within them. The walls of London may be battered, but the spirit of the Londoner stands resolute and undismayed." Well, I stand resolute with today's Londoners, because together, I believe we can build a better London and show why we really are the greatest city in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadiq. I think we've got a bit of time for questions, about 5 minutes, I'm told. So that's not much. So I think I'm going to probably hoard them. And the first one is about devolution. I mean, we at the Centre for London have always argued for devolution. We sat on the first London Finance Commission set up by Boris Johnson, who of course was passionate about devolution when he was mayor. What is the one power you'd really like to have, which you currently don't, particularly in the context perhaps of the pandemic?
I think what we need is not just powers but resources, and so the power we need is the resources to pack up the power. So that's fiscal devolution. You'll have seen, Ben, I know you follow this. You've been following this assiduously over the weekend. That one of the conditions that the government attached to the second half deal with TfL was in return for me being able to keep free travel for our poorest children and poorest over 60s, but we'll be able to, if we need to, raise council tax to do so. My concern with council tax is it's very regressive. It's one of the most regressive taxes there is. So I think the whole suite of taxes, you talked about this in the LFC report that you sat on, the London Finance Commission report. I think we need those. What I'm saying is not necessarily that we're going to raise more taxes by me having these powers, but we'll be in charge of how they're spent. You know the numbers, Ben, in relation to us versus New York and Tokyo. We got to spend 7% versus 50% in New York and 70% in Tokyo. That ain't fair. In the context of TfL, do you know an amazing stat, which many of those watching this may not know? In London, our drivers pay about £500 million in vehicle excise duty. All of that money leaves London. And those that use our tubes, buses, trams, overground pay for our roads being maintained. That can't be right.
Question over here about that actually Claire Richards has asked about, we've seen this amazing swelling up of sort of community spirit, all these local groups, but how do we harness that? I mean, what could we best do to sort of harness that as a city to address particularly sort of inequality holding back our communities?
Well, firstly, Claire and you, hasn't it been great? Hasn't it been great, this sort of community spirit? And for those that don't live in London, there's this perception about our city that we're not friendly, that everyone's a stranger. And the lovely thing, and I hate talking about positive things in the context of a virus that's killed thousands of people and caused huge sorrow. There's great things about the community spirit that Claire's talked about. The challenge for us, Ben, is coming out of this, as Claire says, how we harness that. And I think we can because of the civil society's influence over society, but also faith groups as well. I've been quite impressed by how, at a time when many of the faith groups, mutual aid groups, civil society, communities, voluntary groups, have seen their funding go down because there's a congregational prayer, people aren't running the marathon to give money and grants dried up and stuff, they're doing even more. And I think what we've got to do as leaders of our city is use the recovery board. The recovery board, for those watching this who don't know, is the first time ever we've had this sort of partnership where the chair of London Council's, Georgia Gould, is ringing up civil servants in City Hall directly, not going through me, and similarly vice versa. And this sort of pooling of expertise, resources, the can-do attitude is quite remarkable. Civil society, businesses, local government, in the context of council, City Hall, sometimes central government are playing ball as well. This recovery board is the way we do it, Ben. The 9 missions, but also let's try and get rid of the silos. At a time of finite resources, we've got less money. Let's try and park our egos and try and work together. And that's going to be one of the things coming out that will be, I think, transformational going forward. And by the way, particularly in the context of a new era of austerity.
One last question, because a few are coming in, about road user charging, because clearly the government, in one of the conditions it initially tried to impose on you for the second bailout, the second round of funding for TfL, was extending the congestion charge. TfL is now going to be very, very strapped for cash. I mean, are you more likely to consider a sort of distance-based road user charging regime in your second term?
Well, there's no secret here that my transport strategy has been looking into road user charging. You remember the congestion charge uses technology from the early noughties. It was 2003 when the first mayor brought in the congestion charge. One of my concerns around the government's conditions was they weren't asking me to extend the congestion charge to reduce congestion, which is what the congestion charge is for. It was to raise additional revenues to fill the black hole left by people not using public transport and the government not supporting London. So a couple of things are happening, Ben. One is the extension of the ultra-low emission zone up to the North and South Circular from October 2021. That's been transformational in improving air quality in central London, NOx going down, particulate masses going down, carbon emissions going down. We've managed in just 4 years before the pandemic, reduce the number of schools in areas where the air was illegal by 97%, reduce the number of homes in areas the air was illegal by 94%. That's before the rollout. So we're already doing that. The issue with road user charging is no other city, forget our size, of any size, has had road user charging. But I've put it in my transport strategy because I want to look at the technology. I want to make sure we are exploring all new avenues. But it's got to be part of the conversation we have with the government around vehicle excise duty. It can't be right for Londoners to suffer a double whammy where they pay road tax that goes out of the city, are expected to pay a congestion charge and a ULEZ and potentially a road user charge, which may replace a C charge in the future. But our team at TfL are world leading when it comes to innovation, and will continue to explore the technology as it is, Ben. We took a big risk with the ultra emission zone, the world's first, 2019. We're rolling it out to the North Circular and South Circular, which is quite a bold thing to do from October 2021. But it has a huge impact in a positive sense on air quality, which is so crucial. My concern, though, is if the government forces us to massively increase public transport fares, what you're not going to see is the movement from car usage to public transport and walking and cycling. And we'll need that movement if it's going to be meaningful change.
And it sounded like there's going to be a commitment in your manifesto to at least exploring road user charging. I'm not sure we knew that there. So there you go, a scoop. Sadiq, thank you very much. It's always great to have you at the London conference, but particularly this year of all years. So thank you so much for sparing your valuable time. And
have a great 4 days, Ben, and thanks to your team.
And good luck. Thank you, Sadiq Khan. Right. Right, I'm going to now say a few words. We're probably a bit behind, so I'm going to go a bit faster than I was planning, and I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, hang on, wait a second. For some reason, my presentation has disappeared, but I'm sure I can get it back in a second. Right. Okay. I've called this talk London's existential year because it's hard to believe we're not at the beginning of some sort of turning point in London's history. Historians will surely view this as a beginning of a new era, or at least the end of an old era. But then when did the era begin? What characterized it? What has gone on this year in particular, and what might come next? Those are the small topics I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I would say that the era that's ending now began in the late 1980s, as London became an exemplar of a new sort of city, one described by Saskia Sassin in her very influential book, Global City, published 30 years ago next year. And as this quote indicates, these were years of major economic and political shifts, including the growth of emerging markets, the rapid acceleration of economic globalization, market liberalizations, the digital revolution, and advanced economies like that of the UK moving to a manufacturing and sort of service-based economy. London, as a long-standing world city with great business strengths, high quality urban environment, great cultural institutions, and so forth, was really well positioned to take advantage of these economic shifts. But at the same time, the capital, supported by national government, also responded with quite a lot of imagination, with the creation of a new set of institutions, including, of course, the Mayoralty itself, Transport for London, and what is today London and Partners, London's overseas promotional agency. So a lot went right. London's population grew and its workforce grew even faster, and we became much better qualified. Today, 1 in every 3 Londoners has a degree, while it's only 1 in every 2 across the country as a whole. As a result, London came to play an even bigger role in the UK economy, making an ever larger contribution to national finances. After years of rising crime rates, these suddenly went into reverse. Incredibly important, I think, for people's sort of willingness to sort of come to the city. And even as migrants from around the world flooded to London, surveys show that people's sort of sense of community cohesion and sort of solidarity across ethnic and other divides went up. But even before the present crisis, before Corona, the old mould was cracking. London came to suffer from a sort of series of global city problems, really problems stemming from its very success. House prices increased, both in real terms and in relation to house prices across the rest of the country, and so did the difficulty of getting a mortgage. Home ownership declined, and renting in the private sector increased, with a big jump in poorer families living in the PRS. In 2005, there were just 3,000 people rough sleeping. Last year, it was 10,000. And of course, a big increase in overcrowding, again, particularly in the private rented sector. Overcrowding in that sector doubled from 6 to 12%. Contrary to perhaps popular assumptions, income inequality remained flat, it didn't grow, and the poverty rate, headline poverty rate, also remained flat. But these remain much higher in London than across the country as a whole, and we saw a really dramatic rise in wealth inequality, which I would say is the most important form of inequality of all. For all of London's reputation as a welcoming and cosmopolitan city, people of colour often struggled. You can see here around 18% of white British Londoners are low paid, but the number is double that for Black Londoners, and even higher, 46% for Londoners of Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage. And congestion and pollution got worse. And we are not anywhere near where we need to be on modal shift. So the mayor set a target that he wants 80% of journeys to be by either public transport or active travel by 2041, but we're not going to hit that target until as late as 2070 on present trends. It's often said that Londoners are giving up their cars, but you can see from this chart here that actually there's a decline in car ownership, even as the population has grown. The decline in the proportion of Londoners owning a car, even as the population has grown, has been very slight. Oops, this is the wrong chart anyway. And development has been sort of very uneven. It sometimes felt like London is one big building site, but in fact, most of the increase in workers and in housing has been in inner London, particularly in East London. And as well as these sort of chronic issues, new issues appeared. So climate change was always there. It's suddenly come to feel very pressing indeed. We've made some progress, but not nearly enough. At the national level, we've decarbonised much of our electricity supply through investment in nuclear and renewable energy. But in London, we still rely very heavily on carbon-emitting gas heaters and fossil fuels to move us around the city. And we'll struggle to meet the government's 2050 carbon neutral commitment, let alone the mayor's 2030 target, without a sort of real step change. This graph here just illustrates that of the top sort of 5 sources of carbon emissions in London, 2 non-residential electricity and residential electricity, we're going to make good progress because we are decarbonising the electric power source, but we've got way to go on residential gas, non-residential gas, and road transport. So as I say, that's going to mean a sort of revolution in our transport system and a sort of huge program of retrofitting our leaky homes and workspaces. And London feelings have intensified and mobilized. Sadiq's already referred to this, but I've been reading Deborah Mattison's book, Beyond the Red Wall, based on focus group that she's done with Red Wall Labour voters who voted Tory for the first time. And these areas have been on the losing side of almost every major change in London over the last 40 years. And a lot of the anger is focused on London, both as a seat of national government, but also as sort of favoured child when it comes to government spending and support, or at least that's the way they see it. Not surprising then, perhaps, that the city, the capital, is voting increasingly differently from the rest of the country. So this looks at voter share over time, and the difference between the way London voters vote and people vote elsewhere. And you can see that back in 1979, we were pretty much voting like the rest of the country, but Labour vote has increased, Conservative vote has declined, and we now really have a sort of quite different sort of political culture in this capital. And perhaps, particularly concerningly, London has fallen down global city rankings. This comes from our friend Tim Moonen at Business for Cities, and it's a sort of composite survey looking at drawing together lots of surveys on how cities are perceived. And you can see, a big fall from 5th place to 14th place for London over the period of sort of 5 years. And it's hard to believe, I think, that either Brexit or the handling of Corona is going to help reverse that trend. And so to Corona itself. Amazing to think it's only been with us for 8 months, but the effect has been extraordinarily profound. As has been widely commented, it's exposed London's inequalities, above all perhaps in the way that some Londoners, particularly from Black and ethnic minority communities, have proved especially vulnerable to the virus, whether because of the nature of their work, housing conditions, underlying health issues, or social status. We've seen something similar when it comes to the economic impacts of the virus, with wealthy and knowledge workers able to work remotely, and those dependent on hospitality or other face-to-face businesses where wages tend to be lower, losing work and income. Beyond this, the pandemic has upended essential parts of London's business model. Large sections of its economy, especially the centre, depend on international and national visitors, commuters, and nightly thrill seekers, but these have deserted or been barred from the city, threatening jobs, as well, of course, as government taxes and TfL finances. And we've moved into this sort of Alice in Wonderland where public transport has become a mode of last resort. As this graph says, we've really very dramatically just changed the way that we live. I've summarized it here by just saying Londoners have given up commuting in favor of going to the park or staying at home. And this does feel like a bit of an existential crisis for large global cities. These cities have enormous attractions. I don't expect London sort of to collapse anytime soon. It also seems increasingly likely, at least to me, that the city is simply not going to sort of bounce back, and that we're likely to see some sustained fall in commuting and in international travel. There are opportunities here as well as challenges. In retrospect, it does seem there was something sort of really unsustainable and a bit irrational in the daily commute, the budget mini breaks, and the business frequent flyers. And in the longer run, we could end up with a sort of greener, more efficient, and sort of less routine city. But the challenges, I think, that currently feel more obvious and certainly more pressing, than the opportunities. Unemployment, for instance, has grown faster in London than elsewhere, and that's even before the recently announced lockdown. The other sort of new issue is, as Sadiq has already referred to, that devolution seems to have stalled. There's been a lot of talk about devolution in recent years, but if we look at spending or headcount, we can see that the general direction of travel over a long period since 1999 has actually been the central state growing faster than the local state. I mean, both grew under Labour. The central state continued to grow. This is headcount under the Conservatives, and the local state has fallen very dramatically. Nevertheless, there's been some devolutionary moves, including, of course, self-government for Scotland and Wales, and the creation of the GLA and the metro mayors elsewhere. I think a third of London's population now lives under, a third of England's population now lives under a directly elected mayor. My colleagues, Jack Brown, Richard Brown, and Tony Travers are about to publish a book marking the 20th anniversary of London's mayor, and the verdict is a very positive one. But even before Corona struck, the government was showing surprisingly centralizing tendencies. Surprising because I think Boris really did believe in devolution when he was mayor, and it featured very very largely in his 2019 manifesto. But in March, Robert Jenrick issued a very tough letter to the mayor demanding a rewriting of the London plan. This was pretty much unprecedented in 20 years of that plan. The government's planning white paper, published a couple of months ago, which promised the most radical shake-up in planning for 70 years, did not include a single significant mention of the mayor. The devolution white paper first promised when Boris became prime minister, and then promised again, I think in the manifesto, was renamed the devolution and local growth white paper, and has now been kicked into next year. And Corona seems, if anything, to have intensified the government's controlling instincts, especially when it comes to London. So as you will know, like train and bus operators up and down the land, London's TfL's fare box has collapsed. But where the government has provided more or less unconditional funding for rail operators outside London, it's sought to impose tough conditions on TfL. Though the announcement this weekend of the new funding package is really very welcome. But at the same time, it feels like the present crisis is sort of testing Westminster and Whitehall centralism. Countries with a more federal structure like Germany seem to be doing much better on things like test and trace. And the directly elected mayors have been able to use their political mandates, and in the north, the language of levelling up, to get real political leverage. And it just seems to me there's an increasingly sort of obvious tension between the really big electoral mandates and soft power of London and other mayors and their very limited policy powers, and something surely has got to give. So London, I think, is at a turning point. We, in fact, at Centre for London, are embarked upon a once-in-a-generation strategic review of the capital, London Futures, already referred to by Sadiq. Our first report, published last September, was called London at a Crossroads. We've looked in more detail than I've been able to do here at how London's developed over the last 30 years, how it compares to other cities, and research from the big external factors likely to shape and constrain London's future over the next 30 years. And we've identified 6 in particular, and they are mentioned here. And we've set out possible futures for London in terms of 5 scenarios. So each scenario is imaginable within the next 30 years. Each follows years of accumulated change in a single broad direction, and each entails sort of costs as well as benefits. I'm not going to go through them all. I just describe a couple of them. So the 15-minute city prioritizes environmental sustainability, quality of place, and local communities and community businesses, with petrol and diesel cars and gas boilers banned, tight restrictions on aviation, and a new neighbourhood or parish level of community governance for London. London Mega Capital prioritizes economic growth, connectivity, and mobility, with London and the Greater South East becoming ever more closely integrated, and an expanded London boundary and more open international borders. Finally, Safety First London prioritizes security, resilience, and health, with primary care and social care expanded, tough restrictions on unhealthy food and drink, mandatory citizen health monitoring, and adaptation to climate change. So those are just sort of some of the sort of possible futures that we've developed for London, just to help us think about the sort of city that we want to be and understand better what the sort of trade-offs are. Of course, the problem we keep running into in thinking about how we address London's issues, plan for the future, and create the fairer and greener city that we want is the weakness of London government, already now referred to many times this morning. But we shouldn't underestimate our power either. We might not have raw policy power or political power, but 30 years ago, at the last turning point in London's history, London had even less power. This was the time when Thatcher had abolished the GLC, and London was often said to be the only major Western capital without an elected government. But the city came together and demanded better. There was a genuinely broad coalition that incorporated left-wing borough leaders, conservative politicians, architects, planners, civil society, and business groups, and they commissioned research. They explored and debated values and objectives, and they campaigned hard and actually affected, as we've seen, real change, and changed the sort of way London was governed and it was run. And we hope London Futures and this week's London conference can contribute something similar today. And my colleagues, I think, are going to post a link in the Zoom chat box and on Twitter to London Futures so that you can get involved and feed in. Thank you very much. I am going to pass this back to Kate.
Thanks, Ben. That was a great presentation. And as mentioned, you can look up our London at a Crossroads report for more detail on the global forces Ben's talking about at centreforlondon.org. I've had a look at the Q&A box and there's some good questions, but we are going over time now because we were lucky enough to get some questions with the mayor. So I'll just ask to throw one out there for you, Ben. Given the anti-London feeling you're talking about, but also the many things that London has in common with other UK city areas, how do you think we can find common cause over devolution with those other cities?
Well, I mean, I think as others have said, the coronavirus has been the sort of making of the metro mayors. I mean, even as they've sort of run into trouble with government and government's instincts, as they often are at a time of sort of national emergency, of being centralizing. We all know who Andy Burnham is. We know who Steve Rotherham is. We know who Andy Street is. And they just feel much more like the mayor of London suddenly. And I think people now are thinking about those in the sort of same way. So I think in adversity, we've sort of created a sort of stronger sort of communality. And I think it'll be very hard just because of their large popular mandate now. It'll be very, very hard to sort of roll back on those institutions.
Great. Well, since we are going over time, I'll just say that this is a wonderful start to a very busy 4 days. Thank you again to our sponsors, major sponsors, the Corporation of the City of London, L&Q and Uber, supporting sponsors, London Councils, the London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera and Trust for London, and exhibitors, Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. After we finish this, there's going to be a networking session in a separate Zoom, which everybody should have the link to in the joining instructions you got this morning. So that's first come, first serve, but do come there to discuss what you've heard this morning and what we'll talk about over the next 4 days, meet some friends, meet some new people. And our next session will be this afternoon at 2:30. It'll be dealing with London's controversial historical monuments and statues. That will feature historian David Olusoga, Sharon Ament from the Museum of London, Sundar Katwala, the Director of British Future, and the Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Debbie Weeks-Bernard. But we're having a really great intro from a blue badge guy, Dominic Bursnorth. So thank you so much, everyone. We will see you in the networking session and later this afternoon.